Have you ever lived through chaos? Have you ever lived through trauma? An experience that was so disorienting, so jarring that it changed the way that you saw all of life. In many ways, the book of Jeremiah comes to us at just that place. Jeremiah is a bit of an anomaly in our Old Testament. In our Old Testament, it comes after the book of Isaiah, and even though it has not as many chapters as Isaiah or as many chapters as the book of Psalms, it still falls right there afterwards. But in Hebrew, the original language of the Old Testament, Jeremiah is actually the longest book in all the Old Testament. It has more Hebrew words in it than any other one. And those words are full of weeping and mourning. Jeremiah is often called the mourning prophet or the weeping prophet. He's also associated with the book of Lamentations, which is just story after story, poem after poem of the devastation that hit Jerusalem in the days after King Nebuchadnezzar came and took away the exiles into Babylon. And so the book of Jeremiah reads much like a primer on what happens when you live through chaos. What happens when you live through the pain of excruciating trauma. And so Jeremiah gives us the details of how God walks with his people through times even like that. In many ways, chapter 1 of Jeremiah details the call of Jeremiah into ministry, but after that, after we leave chapter 1, it sort of propels us into this chaotic life of Jeremiah. The book itself is actually not chronological. Some of the sections seem to happen earlier in ministry, early on in the book. And then there's some other sections as we get later in the book that do seem to happen later on in Jeremiah's ministry. But strictly speaking, the book of Jeremiah is not a chronological retelling of the way that the events occurred in Jeremiah's life. Instead, we'll get snippets. Here's a story of what happened, and then here's another story of what happened, and here's another story of what happened. But the chapter numbers of those stories are not necessarily in chronological life order. Also, we'll get stories of Jeremiah's parables or Jeremiah's enacted metaphors of what God thinks about his people and what he's going to do with his people. But the reality is, those stories, those parables, those metaphors may have been given at different points in Jeremiah's life, and again, not necessarily in chronological order. We see the city of Jerusalem fall multiple times in the book of Jeremiah, not because it did fall multiple times. It just means we get several tellings of the same event. One comes towards the end of the book, but when one comes in the very last chapter of the book. In fact, if you've ever tried to just read through Jeremiah, it actually can feel pretty disorienting. You're reading through and you're like, wait a second, didn't we just talk about this? And wait a second, wasn't Jeremiah doing this? And now why is he doing this? And how does this fit here? And how does this fit here? And how do all of these pieces fit together? And I think the book of Jeremiah actually feels a little bit like what I imagine Jeremiah the person might have been a little bit like. A little disoriented, a little bit just confused at all of this chaos that was happening around him. In many ways, I think the structure of the book of Jeremiah is sort of a picture of what happens when life is in chaos. And so, let's begin our study of the book of Jeremiah here in Jeremiah chapter 1. The words of Jeremiah, it says, verse 1, the son of Hilkiah, one of the priests living in Anathoth in the territory of Benjamin. So this helps us place Jeremiah as one of the priests. He serves the Lord. That's part of his family business. And he lives in Anathoth, but he will not stay there. In fact, his ministry throughout the book of Jeremiah happens mostly in Jerusalem. He travels a little bit as he goes throughout his ministry, ends up leaving Jerusalem at several points, but by and large, Jeremiah's ministry consists of focusing in on the city of Jerusalem, giving a message to the people of God living in the land of Judah. Here's what it says in verse 2. The word of the Lord came to him in the 13th year of the reign of Josiah, son of Ammon, king of Judah. It also came throughout the days of Jehoiakim, son of Josiah, king of Judah, until the 5th month of the 11th year of Zedekiah, son of Josiah, king of Judah, when the people of Jerusalem went into exile. I think at this point it's helpful for us to begin to understand exactly what happened with the kings of Judah. Now, if you ever have read through the Old Testament book of Kings, you've surely been a little bit puzzled by all of the different kings of Israel and Judah as they come through. And it's a little bit difficult to follow at times which king is reigning and how long are they reigning and which kingdom are they reigning over. So I think it might be helpful for us here at the beginning to just back up a little bit, and ask the question, where does this fall in the history of Judah? So I just want to talk through several of the kings of Judah so that we can get a better handle on what exactly is happening in the book of Jeremiah. The first king I want to talk about is King Uzziah. King Uzziah reigned in the days of Isaiah. If you remember, Isaiah's sort of prophecy, his call into ministry came in the year that King Uzziah died. Uzziah actually had a 50-year reign, and there was relative stability during his lifetime. Overall, he was a pretty good king, although he made some questionable choices. He tried to offer a sacrifice on the altar in Jerusalem, and that did not go well. He ended up breaking out in leprosy and had to spend the rest of his days living somewhere else. But overall, Uzziah was a good king. Isaiah's prophecies began in the year that King Uzziah died, and his son Jotham took the throne. Now, Jotham did not reign for very long. Jotham just reigned for a couple of years altogether. And we actually don't know much about Jotham's reign. After Jotham, though, came Ahaz. Ahaz was not a good king. Ahaz was one of the worst kings, in fact, of all of Israel and Judah. Ahaz ended up sacrificing his son to foreign pagan deities. He built a copy of the Assyrian altar in the temple at Jerusalem. He was one of the worst kings. He led the people deep into idolatry and pagan, turning away from the Lord. And this was a terrible period in Israel's history. Much of the prophecies of Isaiah happened during the reign of King Ahaz. After Ahaz, his son Hezekiah came to power. Hezekiah actually was a good king. In fact, he was one of the best kings of Judah. Hezekiah reigned during the period when the Assyrians were really taking over more and more and more territory. And in fact, the Assyrian threat was weighing pretty heavily on Hezekiah and on Jerusalem. It's during Hezekiah's days that the Assyrians actually even make it all the way up to Jerusalem. And they're ready to attack Jerusalem. They send messengers into the city to try to get the people to surrender. It's a very critical time for the people of Judah. But what does Hezekiah do? In the face of the Assyrian threat, he turns to God. He turns to Yahweh, and he pleads for help. God answers his prayer, and miraculously, God saves the people. And so Hezekiah was a good king. However, after Hezekiah comes Manasseh. Manasseh was one of the worst kings in all of the history of Judah. Manasseh also had a very long reign, which I think only exacerbated how terrible his reign really was. He built not just one altar, but several altars, pagan altars, in the temple in Jerusalem. And also, he sacrificed his son in the fire, just like his grandfather Ahaz had done. He led the people further into pagan idolatry, and he was a terrible, terrible king. However, there was some stability during his reign. 50 years he was on the throne or so, and then his son Amon took over. Amon reigned for only about 2 years, a pretty short reign, and then his son Josiah came to the throne. Josiah is one of the most popular kings of ancient Judah, and he was also a good king, much like Hezekiah. It's during the days of Josiah that as they're doing work in the temple of the Lord, as they're sort of trying to rebuild and restore some of the temple, they find the book of the law. Apparently, during the days of Manasseh and during the days of Ammon, these books had been lost. People were not reading from the law on a regular basis, and they'd sort of been buried away or put away and forgotten. And so they uncover the book of the law, which is probably something like the book of Deuteronomy, and they read from it, and the people realize what they've done. Josiah realizes how far they've come, and because of the reading of the book of the law, Josiah institutes all of these reforms to purge the land of idolatry. Josiah goes through and smashes down pagan altars. He smashes all of these altars or idols, and he really cleanses the land of so much of this pagan idolatry. However, Josiah's reign, at the end of Josiah's reign, he tries to go up against Egypt, and he is killed by the Egyptians in battle. And so it's during the reign of Josiah that Jeremiah receives his call, that he enters into ministry. And after Josiah, then his son Jehoahaz comes to power. During the reign of Josiah, towards the end of his reign, right, the Egyptians are gaining more power, and they're trying to take over more of the region. And so once they kill Josiah in battle, then really they're kind of controlling things in the land of Judah. And so Jehoahaz actually only ends up reigning for about 3 months, and then he is taken away to Egypt. He was not a good king in those 3 months, I guess as evil as you could be in 3 months of reigning, but then he's taken away to Egypt, and so he's no longer on the throne. After that, Josiah's next son, Eliakim, comes to the throne, and he ends up taking on the throne name Jehoiakim. Jehoiakim ends up reigning for 11 years, and he is not a good king either. Nebuchadnezzar beats Egypt during his reign, and so this is bad news for Judah. And Jehoiakim is trying to figure out how to make sense of life and how to lead his people through this difficult time. Towards the end of his reign, he switches his allegiance from Egypt to Babylon, but then he ends up changing his mind and switching back. And as you can imagine, that did not go well. The Babylonians come in and attack. And we actually don't know how Jehoiakim died, but it does say that he got a donkey's burial, which I think was not a way to say that he was honored in his burial or honored in his death. He had an evil reign, and it did not end well. And so Jehoiakim's son, Jehoiachin, he ends up coming to power, and he reigns there in Jerusalem, but again, only for a very short period of time. He ends up being exiled to Babylon by the Babylonians, and he lives out his days living in exile in the land of Babylon. Because the Babylonians have taken away Jehoiachin, now they decide to put somebody else on the throne. And so what they do is they actually go back and find another son of Josiah, whose name is Zedekiah, and they place him on the throne. Zedekiah ends up being the last king of Judah. He's the one who will lead the people straight away into exile. And overall, Zedekiah is not a good king. He's lukewarm to the Babylonians, despite Jeremiah's words all throughout his ministry to turn to the Babylonians, to surrender to the Babylonians. He doesn't want to do this at all. Finally, he decides, you know what, I'm just going to rebel against Babylon altogether. And because of that, the Babylonians decide to come and attack Jerusalem once and for all, and they put the city under siege, and after a short time, they're able to overcome the city and defeat Zedekiah. And so, the story of the history of Judah is one of this downward spiral, it seems, where the people get closer and closer to the edge. God continues to call out to them. God continues to warn them against this path that they're headed down, but they refuse to listen. As we get towards the end of Judah's history, God actually says multiple times through the prophecies of Jeremiah, just surrender to Babylon. Just surrender to Babylon. Give in to Babylon. But the people, they're so hesitant to do it. They don't want to do it because surrender sounds so terrible to them. John Goldengay tells the fable of a man who fell off the edge of a cliff, and as he was falling, he grabbed onto a tree root. And so there he is, dangling over the edge of the cliff, and he's crying out, somebody help me, somebody help me. Finally, after he's hanging there for a while and he's calling out, all of a sudden he hears this voice from heaven, just let go and I will save you. Silence. And then the man says, is there anybody else? Letting go can indeed be a scary proposition, especially when you're letting go into the hands of your enemy, and that enemy is Babylon. Yeah, that seems exactly what God is asking the people to do. They refuse, and then they experience the consequences of their choices. Zedekiah ends up being captured. His sons are killed before his eyes. He's taken away to Babylon, and he dies. Meanwhile, the commander enters the temple in Jerusalem. He burns Jerusalem to the ground, and it's a devastating loss for the people of Judah. So, what are we to make of all of these words, the story of the kings of Judah? Well, Kathleen O'Connor says that trauma has a way of disorienting us. Disasters have a way of ruining foundations in life, of overturning routine. And survivors of disaster, particularly, have fragmented memories. They have their language that sort of breaks down at points. They become numb. They lose faith. And in many ways, the stories they tell as they reflect on the disaster that happened to them or the chaos that happened to them, especially when it's not processed, those stories can be very disjointed. In many ways, I think that's what happens in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah, in some ways, is a case study in trauma. It is not a tidy or polished book like some of the other books of the Old Testament. It is not a carefully thought out tome of how we are to think about God in this specific time or in this specific age. Instead, it seems to come to us as this almost chaotic anthology of real life. Jeremiah reads like a real life account of what it's like to live through chaos and trauma. And I think because of that, there's an invitation to us to find meaning. I just want us to read through a few more of these verses in this session. Verse 4, the word of the Lord then came to me. This is to Jeremiah. I chose you, God says. Before I formed you in the womb, I set you apart before you were born. I appointed you a prophet to the nations. And Jeremiah says, but I protested, oh no, Lord God. Look, I don't know how to speak. I'm only a youth. And then the Lord said to me, don't say I'm only a youth. For you will go to everyone I send you to, and you will speak whatever I tell you. Don't be afraid of anyone, for I will be with you to rescue you. This is the Lord's declaration. Verse 9, then the Lord reached out his hand, and he touched my mouth. And he told me, I have now filled your mouth with my words. See, I have appointed you today over nations and kingdoms, to uproot and to tear down, to destroy and to demolish, to build and plant. This will be Jeremiah's troubling task. He will be given the job of both uprooting, of both tearing down and building and planting. These are the tasks of Jeremiah in his ministry, to prophesy the devastation that is coming to the land of Judah and also to other nations. We'll get there as well, but also to prophesy the hope that remains for the people who remain devoted to God. The word of the Lord came to me. What do you see, Jeremiah? I replied, I see a branch of an almond tree. Verse 12, the Lord said, you've seen correctly. I watch over my word to accomplish it. Then the Lord said to me again, what do you see? And I said, I see a boiling pot, its lip tilted from the north to the south. And then the Lord said to me, yes, disaster will be poured out from the north on all who live in the land. Indeed, I am about to summon all the clans and the kingdoms of the north. This is the Lord's declaration. They will come. Each king will set up his throne at the entrance to Jerusalem's gates. They will attack all her surrounding walls and all the other cities of Judah. You know, verse 16 goes on to detail just exactly how terrible it will be. I will pronounce my judgments against them for all the evil they did when they abandoned me to burn incense to other gods and to worship the works of their hands. Now get ready, Jeremiah. Stand up and tell them everything that I command you. Don't be intimidated by them or I will cause you to cower before them. Today I am the one who has made you a fortified city, an iron pillar and bronze walls against the whole land, against the kings of Judah, its officials, its priests, and the population. They will fight against you, but never prevail over you, since I am with you to rescue you. This is the Lord's declaration. I do not envy the task that was set before Jeremiah, the call that was placed on him to declare destruction and devastation to this people he loved. But I think there's a powerful word in Jeremiah chapter 1. It's that even though God's people are headed for disaster, even though they are going down this path that will end up in their destruction, God is right there with them. God is walking alongside of them all along the way as they head into trauma. And I think the message of Jeremiah chapter 1 is that God is present, God is with them, and he will continue to be with them in the midst of it all. You know, there's no real word of hope or joy that we can speak to people who live through unspeakable trauma. But I think just the fact that God is with his people, that God doesn't abandon them or leave them altogether, that he continues to walk with them, even on dark and lonely roads, I think can be a great encouragement for us. And I hope that can be a word that encourages you today from the book of Jeremiah.